Greetings, everyone. Glad to have you back. I'm Justin Jacobs, Professor of History at American University, and we are continuing with our second of many different talks in which I'm going to give a supplementary illustrated lecture about the chapters in the book, The Compensations of Plunder, complete with additional images and whatnot of archives, diaries, photographs that I couldn't include in the book. And also, of course, the whole point of this is to help reinforce the things that you may read about and maybe only have sort of a passing understanding of, or you're still maybe a bit confused. I want to make sure we have another opportunity, even if we can't really communicate directly with one another here. This is going to be a one-way street, of course, but I do think it'll help you to better understand many of the concepts and details that we find in this chapter. So we're talking about chapter 1, Sahibs in the Desert. And what we want to understand, our focus in this chapter is what are the incentives and disincentives for the mostly lower class, often illiterate, mostly Muslim, but sometimes when they get into the heartland of China, you can also have Chinese peasants as well. But these are generally going to be poorer people who don't have much of an education, probably don't have any education at all, although some of them may be able to do some rudimentary reading and writing and whatnot. Why are they joining an expedition? Because as we know, archaeological expeditions and excavations are immense, massive logistical undertakings. You need a lot of people who are willing to lend their services to the Western archaeologist. He cannot simply walk into a foreign country, go to a remote area, and think he's going to be able to remove 100 crates of antiquities weighing, many tens of tons. Not going to happen. You have to have the active cooperation of the national authorities, the imperial authorities of the host country. You need to have the cooperation of the local elites, the local officials. That'll be in the next couple of chapters that we're looking at. And you have to have muscle power. Who's going to tend to the camels? Who's going to do the actual sweaty work of digging? Well, it's not going to be very sweaty if they're working in the Taklamakan Desert in the middle of the winter and it's 10 degrees below zero. But nevertheless, there's a lot of just physical, often mind-numbing, sometimes dangerous labor that is going to occur in the course of an archaeological expedition. And generally speaking, the locals are free to refuse the entreaties of the foreign archaeologist. He does have to hire them. Usually there has to be voluntary lending of their services to him. Every once in a while, he's able to draw upon local corvée regulations in which the locals owe a certain amount of labor to their own local authorities every single month. And sometimes the local authorities, to please the foreigner, will simply transfer that corvée obligation from themselves to the foreigner. So the corvée labor actually ends up being the local, lower class peasants and whatnot have to go on an archaeological dig, and that counts as their monthly corvée labor for the local authorities. However, this is relatively rare. Vast majority of the time, the foreign archaeologist shows up and says, I need 10, 20, 30, 100 men. And they say, well, what are you going to give us? Why are we going to go out with you for weeks at a time into the cold, freezing desert and do manual physical labor for you for work that, quite honestly, we don't find terribly interesting. We're not educated like you, so they're not really necessarily engaging with these artifacts in the same way. What are you going to give me for it? And he has to offer something, many things in return. So what are the compensations of cooperation for the economic lower classes who provide mostly manual and technical labor on the expedition trail? All right, so we open up this chapter and we have this wonderful little scene that I was able to find in Paul Palio's French diary, in which we are able to understand the different ways that antiquities can be valued by different people. Not everyone views these things as having the same valuation. So here we're seeing, I have a couple of images just to sort of, set the mood, I guess, of the sort of antiquities that we're looking at. This is a antiquities shop in Khotan, the oasis of Khotan, along the southern rim of the Taklamakan Desert from 1922. This photograph was taken by the British consul Claremont Screen. This is a good, illustration, you have this one in the book as well, of the sort of antiquities that they're going out into the desert to find. A lot of this stuff is mostly Buddhist in form, but oftentimes they will be able to see in their eyes evidence of sort of Greek influences from Central Asia, and we would classify much of this under the category of Gandharan art if it reveals some sort of South Asian or Central Asian influences. Here again, a wonderful photograph. I think this is from Stein's archive of a Buddha head. And once again, here we have, this is from Paley's photograph. So this is a good image to keep up here, because we open up the chapter with his wonderful little story about how he wakes up one day and discovers, I have 3 of my heads are missing, 3 terracotta heads. It could very well be these 3 heads right here, actually. I don't know. I haven't been able to correlate the photograph with his diary entries, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were actually these heads that he has in this photograph right here. And he needs to discover what happened to my heads, what happened to the terracotta heads. And of course, it's not real heads. They are heads that were excavated by his men, the local Uyghurs, the Turkic-speaking Muslim peasants who he has hired. And someone has absconded with them. Someone has, while they're digging, they have tried to conceal it and put it in their own pockets and take it away for their own purposes. And we come to understand in the course of him telling the story, we only have his side, so we have to sort of, read between the lines what's really going on here, is that one of his laborers had taken them not to sell them. All right, these heads could have an economic value by selling them to foreigners, selling them to an antiquities curio shop like this one. But we find out this wonderful little vignette in which one of his men has actually taken the heads to give as a gift to the daughter of a local Muslim village headman, someone who has some position. They're flirting with one another. There's this little romance of a young man and a young woman. And in order to win her affection, he gives her the gift of 3 of these terracotta heads. Now, did he give them to her because he thought that she would appreciate their historical value? And, the fact that they're an emblem of Gandharan art? Almost certainly not. In order to do that, you would need to be educated in a certain mode, in a certain type of education that sees Gandharan art as somehow connected to the preferred lineage of Western civilization. I think it's safe to say that these people have not received that type of education. So they're almost certainly not thinking about these in historical terms. What are they thinking of it? Well, perhaps he's giving it to her as some sort of economic present. Here, these are valuable heads. You can sell these on the marketplace and make money. So essentially, he's giving her cash, but not the crude form of just, here's some money, I'm rich, sort of saying, I have access to economic wealth in the form of these heads, and I'm giving them to you. Most likely what I think is going on here is that he truly thinks that the heads are aesthetically pleasing. They are beautiful. Paley himself actually said the heads are particularly beautiful, and he thought it was, the equivalent of giving a little snow globe, with a little castle inside to his girlfriend. And he probably thinks that she's going to be flattered, and she is going to like the fact that she has these pretty works of art in her possession now. That's what I think is going on here. Either way, neither of them are infusing a political agenda into the artifacts. All right? They may be profitable, economically profitable. They may be socially profitable. All right, this is sort of a gift that a paramour gives his lover to get their attention, but they are not going to be seen as an emblem of a political agenda. See, that's the difference. With Paleo, these heads are absolutely a symbol of the commitment of his imperial sponsor, the French Empire, the French commitment to the Enlightenment ideals of science, preservation, and education, very lofty, abstract ideals. We're improving the world. Okay, it's an emblem of the French Empire's commitment to Enlightenment ideals and Paleo's commitment, his professional commitment to the French Empire and those same ideals. So for Paleo, this is priceless. This is priceless. There's no form of compensation that can make up for the loss of these treasures. He's not going to accept any money for it. All right, the symbolic value of it to him, when it is attached to a political agenda, is quite different than the valuation that the locals are going to infuse into these artifacts. They both have a valuation. Neither of them think they're worthless, okay? But their valuation is quite different. And as we'll see, when you have a different two parties valuing something in different ways, you just have to figure out what the exchange rate is. And as long as one side covets it more and has the resources to compensate the other person to their satisfaction, you're not going to have any acrimony, generally speaking. You're not going to have intractable conflict like we have today when all parties regard it as priceless and are unwilling to budge. This is a symbol of our political agenda, our nation. And therefore, there's no price that you could possibly give us that would compensate for that. You can't possibly put a price on the Mona Lisa. Well, an insurance company could potentially do that to insure it, but the Louvre would never sell it. You could offer $100 million for the Mona Lisa. They will not sell it. The symbolic value of what it means to the Louvre and to the French state in general is beyond any economic valuation. So we then continue to try to understand what were the Western modes of interaction between Muslim peasants in northwestern China and the pre-Islamic antiquities of the same area that these Muslims were living in. That is to say, before Westerners arrived on the scene to do their expeditions, how did the Muslim peasants, the people today known as Uyghurs, interact with the ancient antiquities that were beneath the sands of the Taklamakan Desert? Now remember, the Uyghurs are Muslims. Most of the stuff that's coming up out of the ground is pre-Islam. Usually it's Buddhist, all right? Not always. Here you're just getting several images from the archives. I believe these are from Stein's archives. Give you a little sense of these expeditions. These are the Uyghurs who he's hiring for manual labor. These are the camels. You can see their backs strapped with 2 crates each filled with antiquities that they are helping Stein to excavate from the desert sands. Boy, looking at this, I feel sorry for those camels. That is an awful lot of weight for them to be carrying. And those are not filled with pillows. Those are filled with a lot of terracotta heads and statues and all that sort of stuff. What exactly is being unearthed from the soil? Well, here's sort of an example. Originally, in the early days, most of it was sort of Central Asian and South Asian influenced scrolls and antiquities. Art, sculpture that was more or less Gandharan art, Buddhist sutras, but you have a little smattering of other religions and languages in here as well. There is some Christianity. Nestorian Christianity did reach into East Asia, a religion that eventually goes extinct known as Manichaeism. You're going to have stuff in Sanskrit. You're going to have stuff in dead languages like Khotanese. I think there's over 20 different scripts and languages that ultimately are going to be unearthed in the antiquities that come out of the Taklamakan Desert. All of these things, however, would have a perception of cultural discontinuity with the local Muslims. Even if they're literate Muslims, they're going to be literate in Islamic scripture, in the Islamic literary tradition, and they have been trained and reared to regard pre-Islamic stuff as generally worthless, or generally something that they should not be identifying with in any meaningful cultural sense. So we have the early valuation, one possible valuation that we see the locals having with the antiquities beneath the Taklamakan Desert before the Westerner arrives is simply they regard it as worthless. They regard it as worthless. And if they regard it as worthless, this means that it results in aggressive destruction, iconoclasm. Now, oftentimes, many people who are not Muslims, the Christian world likes to imagine that Muslims are crazy iconoclasts and they always go out and violently destroy any sort of emblems and idols of other religions. It happens sometimes. It actually happens a lot less than non-Muslims think it does. That's relatively rare. Just like military plunder, that's relatively rare, although it does happen every so often. And when it does happen, it gets a lot of attention and convinces people that it happens much more often than it actually does. So sometimes, yes, the Westerners would come in and find caves that were clearly defaced deliberately, Buddha's eyes, poked out and whatnot, and then someone leaves the rest of it alone and leaves. So yes, aggressive destruction of things that are regarded as worthless, or maybe even worse than worthless, actively hostile to what our religion represents. And then sometimes you would say they don't really see it as worthless, but they treat it in a sense that we might describe as passive disposal. We have examples, the Westerners would say that before they knew that I coveted these things, someone would find it. They would regard it as worthless, but they wouldn't destroy it. They would sort of throw it into the river. Maybe this has some evil god spirit inside and we're going to throw it into the river. Or just, I'll give it to my kids. I don't regard it as dangerous, but I don't really have any use for it. So here's a book of old manuscript papers. I'm going to give it to my kids. It has funny writing on it. And the kids play with it, do whatever kids do with it. give them a little statue, that sort of thing. That's like the equivalent of an ancient doll. And then eventually it's destroyed by the kids. Kids don't necessarily handle these things all too gently. So aggressive destruction or passive disposal if they regard it as worthless. There were some things that were regarded as profitable. Okay, profitable even before the Westerner arrived on the scene. Even before you had the possibility of being able to sell anything to the Westerner, you could say that the local Muslims did regard these things as profitable. And when we talk about local Muslims in northwestern China, just understand this is our in-depth case study that comes from my research. I do believe you can extrapolate from this case study to talk about people all throughout the world, wherever you find Western expeditions. Always remember that although we're focusing on northwestern China, I do believe that this is what the insights we gain are applicable to archaeological expeditions throughout the world that are going on at the exact same time period. So what was regarded as profitable even before the Westerner arrives on the scene? Precious metals, grave goods. Oftentimes cemeteries and graves would be looted. Oftentimes they were looking for things like coins. Coins might be placed in the mouth of a corpse. You go in, you take those coins out. The Westerners arrived, and when they were digging in cemeteries, they found evidence that these things had been previously dug into as well by ancient grave robbers. Gold. Oftentimes, everyone seems to think that Stein is looking for gold, even though he tells them, I'm not so crude and crass as to be looking for gold. I want historically important stuff. It's clear that most of the locals who are not tuned in to his intellectual agenda, because they haven't been educated in the same way that he has, they say, nonsense. Of course he's looking for gold. That's the only reason why someone would expend this much effort and resources and money to go out into the desert for weeks at a time. Obviously, he's looking for gold. What else can they do with things that are regarded as profitable? Well, I use the phrase pragmatic transformation. If it's not a precious metal, gold or coins, sometimes they would find intact wood from ancient edifices or murals or building blocks, ancient bricks and stones and whatnot, that they can basically transform into something that otherwise would cost them money to buy. Here you're seeing one of Stein's digs. Here are the local Uyghurs helping with the dig, and you can see this sort of old lintel, the thing that sort of a main beam above a doorway, is beautifully inscribed here. This is probably 1,500, 2,000 years old. Now, this particular one, Stein is going to take away. He's going to preserve this because he infuses a historical agenda into it. But you have to imagine that many times these sort of things would have been found or stumbled upon by the locals on their own. And they just would have taken it away and they can reuse it. Oh, well, this is a useful building material. If I don't use this, if I don't reuse it, if I don't pragmatically transform it, I'll have to buy a piece of lumber to replace it. So it is a form of economic capital. And if they don't find beautiful ones like this, they may still take away, these sort of things. Look kind of like driftwood here. It's free wood. Murals sometimes are also something that you can knock down and take away. Here you're seeing the 1,000 Buddha motif on an ancient building in the Taklamakan Desert as well. And you would take this and you would say, oh, this has a lot of nutrients in it. You would crumble it down and then you would put it onto your fields as fertilizer. And you can oftentimes do this with ancient bricks and stones as well. Crack them up, sort of grind them into gravel and then put it over your field. And it does serve as fertilizer. And that's fertilizer now that you don't have to buy, or you don't have to spend any time making your own fertilizer. So that is an indirect form of a profitable valuation, right? So worthless or profitable, but profitable in very specific ways. You're not selling it to an antiquities shop yet. Now, all this is going to change with the arrival of Westerners. Now we want to think about what are the post-Western modes of interaction between Muslim peasants and pre-Islamic antiquities. Here's Stein in the middle, his dog Dash, his Chinese secretary Jiang Xiaowan, his Uyghur camel factotum and guide Ibrahim Beg, and then three of his Indian assistants. We'll talk about Lal Singh here a little bit later today as well. One very famous iconic photograph of Stein on his expedition. When the Westerners come, there's going to be an end to the practice of passive disposal and proactive aggressive destruction. Why? Because now you have a new market for crazy Europeans who pay good money, really good money by local standards, for what was previously regarded as worthless stuff. Okay, so the practice of aggressive destruction or passive disposal will disappear once the Westerners arrive and you find they're willing to pay. Now, you'll never get rid of anything with indifference. You will always realize everything has a value. Were the Muslims deceived as to their value? Did they not realize how much the Westerners valued this stuff, and therefore they got cheated out of the fair market value? The way that I look at this is that it's kind of similar to Stuart Banner's argument with the Native Americans and land sales with the European settlers. Absolutely, they could have been deceived the first time, maybe the second time. But after that, these are not morons. They realize what was meant by a land sale, and they start to engage on the European terms, say, I know the value of this now. I know what I can get for this. Paleo, we see in this chapter, we have a quotation from him in which he basically says that, you can get a favorable exchange rate at this one site because it was a virgin site. No one had ever visited it before. I was the first Westerner who ever came and dug here. So the locals didn't realize the value that I placed on it yet. But he says that only works once. That only works once. Once you go there, once they realize how many resources you're willing to expend to acquire this stuff, everyone knows the value that you attach to it, and the price goes up. And the more Westerners who come, the higher the price goes. This is actually why many Westerners will eventually say, hey, we can't be content with staying in the oases anymore in the cities because the price is too high there. We need to go out and cut out the middleman and go straight into the desert and find the virgin site ourselves, because that's the only way we can get a favorable exchange rate. If it comes into the hands of local Muslim middlemen, the price is going to be jacked way up because they know how much we value this stuff and we're still willing to pay it, and they know that. Okay. Now, it's also a little more complex than this, however. Westerners don't have a monopoly on buried antiquities. All right. We talked about this before. The perception is, the rules are finders keepers. It sounds so simple and so crude and so basic and so elementary, but it's true. Time and again, we find people operating on the assumption that he who finds it or she who finds it is the owner. If there's no identifiable owner, if you go out into the sands and you dig and you find an ancient Buddhist stupa and you dig into it, and that stupa is not actively worshipped by a community, no one owns it, it's been abandoned, whatever you find, it's yours. It doesn't belong to the Chinese nation or the Uyghur nation or any nation. That's a later idea. It belongs to whoever found it. That's it. Just like when Stein goes out into the desert, if he finds a new site, whatever he takes, it's his. No one contests his ownership of it. Today, you would say, oh, before it even comes out of the ground, it belongs to the Chinese nation. That is a different valuation from a different generation that was not in operation at the time these expeditions were going on. All right. Remember the story of Albert von Lecoq that we see in this chapter, in which he says, we were on one side of a river and a couple of very disagreeable old women, he's very pejorative towards them, were on the other side. We're both digging. We're both digging in the ground trying to find stuff. And he says, by accident, they dug into an old Buddhist stupa. And then they pulled out all these wonderful, I think, Manichaean documents. And he says they had no idea of the historical value of these documents. I did. And I was so jealous. Those are so valuable. They don't deserve to have it. They don't know what they're finding. I deserve to have it. I am educated. I can appreciate and read these. And he's really upset. But note the denouement of this episode. He says, I had no choice but to pay these very disagreeable old hags very high prices for what they found. This is a very important episode. Okay? He doesn't have any sort of prior right on these things just because he's the educated scholar who comes from a powerful foreign empire. These women found it. It's theirs. And they can charge whatever they want. And he has to pay whatever they want to charge him. Or he can't do anything about it. They can just take it away and take it home and sell it to the next foreigner or sell it to an antiquity shop in town. And Lecoq has no choice. He can't pull out his gun and say, hey, I'm from a powerful foreign empire. You're going to give me those things. No way. He can't do that. And he pays them. He pays them exactly what they want. And he's really annoyed that he had to pay them what he wanted. So you have a choice if you're one of these locals. Okay. You can work with the Westerner for fixed wages. He wants to go find virgin sites where he doesn't have to compete with, previous increased valuations that previous foreign scholars have cultivated among the local population. He wants to find a virgin site. So he'll hire you for fixed wages and perhaps other perks if you impress him. We'll discuss those other perks a little bit later. Or you can search on your own, like these women did. Okay, what are the plus and minuses of this? Well, if you search on your own, it's very dangerous. You could die. The Taklamakan Desert is much more dangerous than Egypt's ruins. Egypt's ruins can be very dangerous as well if you don't know what you're doing. It's not like the curated, manicured tourist site that you have today with all these facilities, electricity, concrete pathways, and all this sort of stuff. 100, 200 years ago, it was very dangerous going into Egyptian tombs. You could easily have the tomb collapse in on you. A dig site collapse in on you. You could fall. It's very hot. If you don't do it at the right season, you could die out there. Oftentimes, to avoid the Westerners, the Western archaeologists, and the local Egyptians would go out in the summer when it's scorching temperatures, because they know the Westerners don't go out in the summer because it's very dangerous to your health to go out in the middle of the Egyptian desert in the summer and try to dig. But that's when they would go, so they could avoid detection. So it is dangerous to go out on your own. The Taklamakan Desert is even more dangerous than Egypt. You have to go way into the desert. These are not suburban locations for the most part. Most of these require a week, 2 weeks foray directly into the desert. Now, it's way too hot in the summer, so they're usually going in the winter. And the Taklamakan Desert is ass cold in the winter, freezing, well below zero with wind chills. I mean, it is miserable. Okay, so you can do that on your own. The rewards will be higher. If you successfully get in and out and survive, all the profit is yours because you own it. It's finders keepers. However, if you're afraid you might die or get injured, that's also expensive. To die or to be injured is expensive. If you die, obviously, it's horrible, but it's also expensive for your family who loses an economic laborer in the family. And if you're injured, you're debilitated and can't work as well either. So the choice to go with a Westerner is that he is more likely to bring you back safe. Yes, some people suffer injuries with the Westerners, but he does have a lot of resources that you may not have on your own. He'll have more food, more water. He'll have navigational equipment. He'll have tents and whatnot, reliable fires, all that sort of stuff. And he has experience. He's done digs before. You are much more likely to come back safe and sound. Not 100% guaranteed, but much more likely if you go out and are willing to work for the wages that the foreign archaeologist is willing to give you. Okay. Of course, you can try to risk it. You can go out on your own. No one's going to stop you. There's no legal reason why you can't do that. And if you can survive and dig your own stuff, you'll maximize your profit because you're cutting out the Westerner. And then you get 100% of the profits when you sell it to a middleman or even sell it directly to a Western archaeologist when you get back in town. One other option is forgeries. And we see this most amusingly during Stein's expedition. He goes, one of the reasons he does his first expedition is actually there's these new strange documents and unknown scripts that are surfacing on the market in Khotan. And Stein believes that these are fake. Many European scholars are being deceived, and he eventually investigates the situation and finds out that there is a guy named Islam Makun who has been duping many foreigners, including the British and Russian consul in Kashgar, into thinking that these are authentic. He says, I'm not going to the desert by myself. That's dangerous. I'm also not going to work for the Westerners. I'm going to come up with a brand new method. I'm just going to create my own fake ancient documents and see if I can deceive people and make money for it. And it actually works for, I think, several years, 5 years or so. He's doing this, makes a good profit until Stein finally comes in and tracks him down and turns him into the local Chinese authority. And the Chinese authorities are just as annoyed as Stein is that this guy was forging documents and eventually uncovers that ruse. But you can try to forge these things. That is another approach, another tactic that you can do. Okay, so in the end, most of the locals, the lower class locals, will work for the foreigners. It's safer, the wages are more reliable, there are other perks that we'll discuss in a minute, and there's always the possibility in the background that maybe the local village headman, your own, beg, might invoke corvée labor, and then you're totally screwed. That's unlikely, but that's always in the back of your mind. Sort of chalk that up to, if we're thinking about the analogy with the Native Americans and the settlers and land sales, maybe the settler will bring in some military force if he has access to it, and then I'm going to lose the land completely and get nothing for it. So there is in the back of your mind that remote possibility. Okay. Also, while working for the foreigner, here's a photograph from one of Paleo's excavations. You can get a sense of how strenuous and dusty and very likely hot it would have been. I guess maybe no, if this is the winter, it's probably not all that hot. But still, this is not a very pleasant work environment. If you work for the foreigner, there are some other things that you can do to try to increase your wages a little bit beyond simply what he's willing to pay you. You could try to sneak new finds into your pockets, sort of like what we saw with the 3 terracotta heads that open up this chapter. Paleo himself often complained about this. Here he is. I like this photograph in this context because he looks slightly annoyed here, sort of like he's just realized that he's been duped by his laborers. Paleo, in this chapter, we see him in his diary complaining about the difficulties of surveillance. No matter how much that I try to implement surveillance against my men, there's always the possibility that they can just slip a little newly excavated thing into the folds of their robe, and I'm just one person. Maybe I'll choose 1 or 2 of my more trustworthy laborers to watch over the others, but still, there's a lot more laborers over a much bigger site than I can possibly watch them. And it's possible that they'll be able to supplement their wages. Not only am I going to pay them their wages, but they're going to sneak stuff into their folds of their robe. And then when they get back, they'll also sell that to a middleman in town or try to sell it to me. Sometimes he actually exposes this where he realizes they tried to sell me. How the nerve of them to try to sell me something that I know they got from the site where I was paying their wages to excavate. And when I pay your wages, everything belongs to me. That's how it works. All right. And then, of course, there's the realization that many of these laborers came to, that the foreigner can't take everything away anyways. These were entire cities that were lost to the desert. They were constructed 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, when ancient mountain glacier water melted off and created a stream that could give rise to an agricultural oasis. When the stream dried up or moved its course, the village was abandoned. These were entire villages that were then buried by the sands of the Taklamakan Desert. They're big sites. The foreigner, no matter how industrious he is, no matter how much work he puts into it, no matter how many laborers he hires, he can't take everything. He's going to have to leave stuff behind. So just come back. Just come back after he's gone. Get your wages. All right, get your wages. And then when he's taken everything he can take, well, how much can he possibly take? When he's taken everything he's going to take, we know how to get here now. He showed us how to get here. We were paying attention. He led us here with his navigational equipment. We saw what sort of provisions we need, what the hardships are. We can do this on our own. And he's gonna leave. Now let's go and organize a few men and prepare adequately, go find that exact same site again, and take everything we can possibly take that he wasn't able to take. Yes, he probably took the best stuff, but that doesn't mean there's still not a lot of profitable stuff that you could get there. Okay. Now, the big picture takeaway point here is still the same. All right. So what we want to understand, sort of our takeaway message from this part of the chapter, is that antiquities in the eyes of the local Muslims in the age before nationalism, antiquities never rise above the valuation of profitable, no matter what method they choose. Forgery, go out on my own, work with the foreigner, try to steal stuff, work with the foreigner, don't steal stuff, but come back later and dig for the site, whatever. All the things we talked about. And even the use of murals and ancient walls for fertilizer, which continues as the Westerners are actually doing their expeditions as well. None of that raises the valuation of any of the antiquities targeted by the Westerner above profitable. No one's saying this is precious or priceless. It's just profitable. Because there's a perception of cultural discontinuity still. That's going to be the one big difference with the Chinese. They too won't regard it as priceless, but they will regard it as precious. So their valuation will be somewhat higher. That's the next 2 chapters. All right. So if it doesn't rise above the valuation of profitable, we've just gone from worthless or profitable to entirely profitable, then there is no possibility of intractable conflict or resort to the discourse of criminalization. No one is going to call Stein a thief, so long as the foreigner has the resources to negotiate with, whether it's wages, whether it's buying something from an antiquity shop, whether it's paying a local Muslim to guide him to a site he found, whatever. So long as he has the resources to obtain these things, he'll get most of what he wants sooner or later without acrimony and without irresolvable conflict. All right. Now, the other part of this chapter is you want to understand some of the other compensations of cooperations and a little bit of the depredations of cooperation. We don't want to leave that out as well. So it's more than just wages. It's more than just wages or selling artifacts that you might find in the course of a dig. All right. The compensations of cooperation also involve your social relationship with the Western archaeologist. I often like to say that he was perceived as the goose that kept on laying golden eggs. All right. The artifact could be sold but once. But if you had a positive, substantive, constructive relationship with the foreign archaeologist, that's a priceless relationship, because he can actually leverage his resources and influence to improve your livelihood. All right, now let's talk a little bit about this. Ellsworth Huntington. Let's start with Ellsworth Huntington. He's an American. He's one of the lone Americans at this time period. And as an American, he likes to think of himself as sort of this egalitarian. I believe in democracy and stuff. We're much more egalitarian than the Europeans, blah, blah, blah. That's pretty rich, for a Yale professor, privileged white man to be talking like that. Nevertheless, it is true that when I'm reading his letters, his diary, he is far more likely to comment on all the expectations of class and decorum that the Europeans take for granted. The Europeans definitely come from a society in which there's more rigid class divisions and assumptions about what people in different stations of life are supposed to act like. Huntington, this is a little bit novel for him. This is a little bit more unfamiliar. And it's in his letters that we get him explicitly talking about how Westerners are perceived in China. And again, throughout most of the non-Western world at this time period. And he says, every single person, every foreigner, every white man is compelled, required to play the role of a great man. We're all seen as rich, and as a result, we must act as local rich men do. By local standards, they are rich. They often don't think they're rich because back home, they're not. Paul Paleo is not rich when he's living in Paris. Huntington is not rich when he's living in New Haven. Stein is not rich when he goes back to live. Well, he doesn't only have a fixed residence. He's all over the place. But wherever he goes, he's not rich. He's comfortable, but he's not a rich man. But when they go to places in the world in which, the GDP, the local average household salary and whatnot is incredibly low, they are perceived as rich men. But this guy has all these resources. Look, he's able to buy 20 camels and hire carpenters to make wooden crates for him. And hire these laborers. He dresses nicely. Of course he's rich by our standards. And we have expectations about what rich people are supposed to do. They're supposed to act like our local rich people do. And they call him a Sahib. The Sahib, this is the word that is applied to all the white men in northwestern China at this time period by the Turkic-speaking Muslims. Now, there's a couple of implications from this. If you're perceived as a rich man, if you're perceived as a Sahib, automatically, because you have access to enormous amounts of resources, you're supposed to be generous with your financial resources. Okay, you're supposed to be generous. It is expected that a rich man will be grateful for his luxurious lifestyle and all his wealth, and he will give back to the community. He's not going to be stingy miser. He's not going to be Uncle Scrooge. He will give back. You help him out. You give him a service. He will reward you amply. 2, he's supposed to act like a rich man. A rich man acts differently than us. Okay, he's supposed to be haughty, aloof, arrogant. If he gets too familiar with us, if he's trying to treat us like his friends, that brings him down in our estimation. Like, what? Come on. Kings are distant. They're cold. They're way beyond, our community. If you're a great rich man, you're supposed to be secluded, distant, unapproachable. You're supposed to be an asshole. Sort of, to a certain extent. And we find Huntington realizing that his men want him to be more arrogant, more haughty, more aloof, and don't get all familiar with all the people. He says, and they're displeased when I'm not. When I want to sit down and have a picnic with the locals who are socially way beneath me, they're not happy because they want me to be perceived as great a Sahib as possible. Remember, he says, they actually had me pick up my little mat and move it 100 yards and eat my mulberries and my yogurt 100 yards away from anyone else. Is it right that a great man like you should sit with a bunch of little men? No. We're going to see where this is all going in a minute. Okay? Where it's going is that they want their Sahib to be perceived as the greatest Sahib around, be perceived as a rich man, even if he might not really be one. Because they can then benefit from the indirect perks of being associated as a servant of one of these great Sahibs. That is to say, the indirect perks of a great Sahib will trickle down to them, trickle down economics, right? And that's why they want him to be perceived as great, because if he's perceived as great, more opportunities will open up to them as his loyal servants who have done him great services and who he likes to work with. They will benefit from this as well. I love this slide here. This is from Huntington's letters. I had to find this and dig this out of my digital archives. This is from the Yale Library. It's always nice, to see the original documents and not just my typed up version of it in the book. These are Huntington's letters back to his family in New Haven in 1905 and 1906. Remember the episode with his traveling companion, another American by the name of Daniel Barrett. Daniel Barrett apparently is sort of like the 1905 version of a 1960s hippie or something like that. And Huntington says, he refuses to be a great Sahib. He won't act in accordance with the expectations of what they say a Sahib is supposed to act like. And it's hurting me. He doesn't like Barrett's behavior. He exercises naked. He saddles his own horse. How dare he saddle his own horse? A great man doesn't saddle your own horse. Poor people saddle their own horse, if you have a horse at all. You're supposed to have servants who do that for you and show the world that you have servants who saddle your horse. Ever seen Downton Abbey? There's some wonderful scenes in Downton Abbey like this. I think where the guy, I forget his name, Matthew, I believe, blonde hair, and he was a lawyer. He actually worked for a living. He inherits sort of the estate and whatnot. And he goes in there, and one of the servants is expecting to dress him in the morning. He's like, "You don't need to dress me. I put my own coat on." And the servant's like, "But that's my job. I do that. And you're a great man. You're inheriting Downton Abbey. You don't put your own clothes on." And he's like, what is this, a silly job, right? And this is kind of like Huntington at the same time period saying, this is silly, but I recognize I'm expected to act this way. Daniel Barrett does not. And here's the passage I want to read from you. The men come up to Huntington and complain about Daniel Barrett. What are their complaints? Here we go. The other in chief grievance is that the men want a Sahib who is a Sahib. I love that. I love that line. A Sahib who is a Sahib. They are ashamed of a man who shuns his fellows, especially the great. He shuns meetings with great Chinese officials because he can't stand the formalities of them, and he's bored by them. And his men, the local Uyghurs, say, "No, we want to meet that Chinese official. That can help our career. Come on." Put this into your own context, your own life. What if you knew someone who was, your neighbor or something like that, or your uncle, worked with the governor of your state or a famous US senator or Bill Gates, and he meets with these people all the time, and you say, "How come you're not taking me along?" Right? Or he doesn't like to meet with them. "Yeah, I know Bill Gates, but he's kind of a jerk. I don't like meeting with him and whatnot. I try to avoid him." You're like, "What? You can help me out. I want to get into Microsoft." These are stupid examples, but I'm just trying to make an analogy here, okay, to your own lives. All right. He shuns his fellows, especially the great, dresses like a tramp, saddles his own horse, how dare he, eats on the floor, takes his exercise naked where all can see him, sleeps alone in the mountains, never can tell beforehand where he is going. In short, as Rasul says, a wild man, an animal. I love it when he gives direct quotes so you can attribute to the people. Remember, we're trying to recover the voice of the voiceless. There it is. If only I could laugh and say it is not so, I should not mind. But it is all true and has been troubling me for months. Wonderful example of the expectations of how a foreign archaeologist should act. This is not just about archaeology. There's a lot of other stuff going on here in the course of an expedition. All right. This sort of stuff still has sort of some echoes today. I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but 20 years ago or so, when I graduated from my BA, I went on backpacking trips in many parts of Asia, all throughout Southeast Asia, China and whatnot. Even though, for me, I was like, I'm a poor backpacker. I've scrounged together a couple $1,000 by working part-time at a bagel shop and whatnot. And I have to carefully manage my money throughout this 3 months of backpacking around Southeast Asia. I did not regard myself as someone who's wealthy or privileged or anything. In fact, I felt I was quite poor. And the only reason I could travel in these places is because things were so cheap. And so I could actually afford it. I was always perceived as someone who, just because I'm a white guy and I'm traveling on the other side of the world, far away from my home, that I somehow was wealthy. And you get that perception that you are wealthy. You are a white guy from America. You must be wealthy. You might be influential. And you find it's kind of embarrassing. I found this many times. I'm not the only one. I go to China and I teach English. I scrounge together enough money for a plane ticket. I have no money really whatsoever. And I go there and all of a sudden it's like I'm some sort of celebrity. And all these people want to take photographs with me and invite me to these dinners and whatnot. And I'm like, I'm just some, Joe Blow, 23-year-old guy with a BA. I'm nothing special, but you're not perceived as that. And they don't like it. It's not appreciated when you don't embrace the more exalted social role that the locals want you to embrace. Why? It's not about you. It's about them. They want to be able to show you off. They want to be able to leverage the perception among their friends and the community that you are indeed a great man, and you're a great man who fraternizes with him. And they can get stuff from that. All right. Paleo glosses this with a wonderful French phrase, noblesse oblige, the obligations of the nobility. Yes, you're privileged in life, but you have obligations to those beneath you. And he's like, what is that one line of Paleo? The local Chinese official gives us two escorts to the next village. We don't need them. They're going to do nothing whatsoever. And I have to pay them a gratuity that's going to tenfold their pay. But noblesse oblige. I'm expected to do this because I'm perceived as a great, resourceful man. And in order to get what I want, a smooth expedition, you gotta attend to this stuff. You gotta give them what they want. And they want you to be a generous Sahib who dispenses with his resources all the time. Huntington, I would have had this, just another image of Stein and his men and whatnot. Back to Huntington. I have the wonderful quotation in this chapter, one of my favorite ones, in which Huntington shows how he is doing what Barrett will not. He says, I'm uncomfortable with it. I'm an egalitarian American. I'm very uncomfortable with being perceived as a great man. But I have to do it. That's what they expect of me. And I don't want acrimonious relationships. I want to please them. So we have this wonderful passage in which he meets the Chinese governor of the province. No, this isn't Rao Yingqi. Is it Lian Kui? Doesn't really matter. He meets the Chinese governor of the province. And what does he do? Yes, these are the perks of the compensations of cooperation beyond mere wages. Here it is in his original handwriting from March of 1906 in Urumqi, the capital. That reminds me of Daoud. His supreme ambition is to become a beg. Not a big beg, but a little one, with some simple work adapted to his ability. A beg is like a local Muslim authority, a village headman, a man of some authority. As he has been very faithful in spite of his shortcomings, and I asked the Fantai, the governor, to give him such an office. That is, to give him a letter to that effect to the local Ambon, the local Chinese official at Kiria, telling at the same time what sort of man he is, faithful and honest, but not especially clever. The Fantai promised to do so, and when he called on me, asked to see the man. Poor Daoud, most horribly frightened, was brought in, and after falling on his knees at the door and bowing his close-shaven head to the ground half a dozen times, advanced nearer to be looked at. I suppose it was the great experience of his life, one that he will boast of till his death. For as Ibrahim said, a man like that could not procure a personal interview with the Fantai, the governor, if he paid $5,000. What a wonderful phrase. You have another Uyghur putting a price tag on it and saying, even if he had $5,000, he never could have gotten this interview with the governor, and the letter that you procured from the governor that will improve this guy's professional mobility. And indeed, Daoud, we can see other foreign archaeologists will meet these guys in future expeditions. Oh, he's been promoted. He's making more money now. He's got a nice big house. Stein gives his own personal recommendations to many people, tells the Chinese officials who admire him, I admire this guy. He was a great guide. Can you give him a promotion? Find something more useful for him. And they'll be able to leverage that into their own economic capital. And then there's, I should have had this up when we were talking about bringing in Daoud to an audience that with local Chinese officials. That's the perks of a great Sahib. Just like I was talking about, you get invited to these dinners that really you have no business being invited to. They're not Chinese, they're not officials. They're archaeologists, but you can then use that opportunity to bring your laborers into the halls of power with you and allow for trickle-down compensations to reach them. All right. There are also, we analyze the wages and the rewards, and we find that in general, the wages and rewards were market rate, at least, and oftentimes above market rate. And there were additional rewards and perks, actual wages, actual cold hard cash paid out to people who were willing to do expeditions if you went beyond, above and beyond the call of duty, and did find additional artifacts and didn't steal them, but gave them, brought them to the attention of the foreign archaeologist. He would give you additional money on top of that. We have the examples from Flinders Petrie in Egypt, in which he also basically talks about how the locals will work for you as long as you're going to pay them. They will defy anything short of open violence in order to work for you and get those wages, because these are seen as attractive wages for the locals. The foreigner is not paying below market rate. That's why they engage his expedition voluntarily. They can make pretty good money. And then there were other ways that we see that expeditions are kind of like, as I describe it in this chapter, an economic stimulus package. Here is a page for one of many pages in Stein's account books, in which you see the things that he's paying for. Take a look at this list. Paying for my quarters, his lodgings, fuel, transport, straw, fuel, quarters, a guide, ponies, TA, that's the daily money that has to be given for people who are rendering you a service, the camel man, the pony man. What else do we got here? Ponies, a cart. I had to pay the local runner, the local employee of a Chinese official who sent me a message, food expenses for one of my employees, wood, carpenters, a guide, had to pay for a telegram, wages for my workers, leather repairs, ropes for camels, camel soles, felts for surveyors and men, more quarters, more fuel, meat for my surveyor, hire a pony, fuel, pony hire, ponies, fodder, fuel, quarters, pony. You get the idea here. This is why I call it an economic stimulus package. This is why he's regarded as a great sahib, a rich man, even though when he goes back home, he's not a rich man. He's middle, comfortable, middle upper class, but he's not rich by no means. All right. And there's many other examples of this in the chapter as well. There's also the aphrodisiacs, the idea that maybe the foreigner will be able, with his superior medicinal science and whatnot, will have the equivalent of, early 20th century Viagra. Maybe he'll have medicine for treatments, all things that would cost you money otherwise to buy it from locals. But he's going to dispense it, oftentimes for free, and it's regarded as superior quality to what you might be able to buy in your local community yourself. I should have had this as well. Darn it, I only had one slide, but here, just once again, all the stuff that you can see that the foreign archaeologists are paying for. Oh, here he's paying for yaks. He must be in the highlands closer to Tibet right here. Pegs for the tent, leather repairs, food, telegrams, salary, postage. There we go. There's some postage, grazing of ponies, fodder. All right, you get the idea. It's getting mind-numbing now. These documents, I have to admit, they are mind-numbing. All right, let's wrap this up. Okay, let's wrap this up. We don't need to assume that everyone was pleased by the compensations on offer. It's important to understand that there were also some depredations of compensation. Okay, we've already met Ram Singh. We already talked about Ram Singh and his complaints. Okay, Ram Singh's complaints. He's not actually pictured here, but we do have other Indians who would have come from the same communities as him, hired by Stein in India. We've already seen his complaints about sort of what we would characterize as workplace disputes, his unhappiness with Stein as his expedition leader, and his recognition that Stein is the one who's going to get all the credit for the expedition, and all I get is my fixed salary. See, men like this, these three men over here, and the Chinese secretary, not Ibrahim Beg, not the Uyghur who hires out his manual labor, but all these guys, they get hired on fixed salaries. They have technical expertise. The Chinese secretary writes Stein's letters to Chinese officials. This guy, I think, is the cook. These two guys are both cartographers. They have technical skills. They are hired on a fixed salary. All right. And they are not going to be at liberty to take Antiquities, right? They can't supplement their wages in the same way that the Uyghur laborers, the manual laborers, can supplement their wages. We have this wonderful example, Li Yansun, this is Stein's secretary from his third expedition, and Jiang Xiaowang, his secretary from the second expedition. Both of these guys were hired on a fixed salary, right? And they're not going to be permitted to go to their own site afterwards. They have to stay with Stein the whole time. They're always by his side. There's no opportunity to obtain additional artifacts. There's no opportunity to go back to the original site. Many of the additional economic perks that are available to the illiterate lower classes are not available to these guys. And they can respond one of two ways. They can either say, I still think that this is a great enterprise. I like to identify with the same intellectual and political agenda that Stein and Paleo have. If I please him, there are still some perks that I can get out of this beyond my salary. Or they can respond and say, you know what, this is a miserable job. I'm going through freezing cold weather throughout the desert for 2.5 years of employment away from home. All I'm getting are these miserable fixed wages. They're fine. But hey, I'm putting up with a lot of hardships to get these wages. I'm gone from my family for quite a long time, and this is not comfortable. It's not pleasant. It's hard, painful work, even if you're not a manual laborer. Right? That was Li Yansun's response. That's the guy on the right, and he even looks unhappy in this picture. He just looks like he was just miserable the whole time on Stein's third expedition. Stein constantly criticizes him, says he never opens his mouth if he can possibly help it. He doesn't help out in my meetings with Chinese officials. He just sits there. All he does is write letters. He's a machine for writing letters, and that's all he does. So Li Yansun was one of those who was not inspired by Stein's higher intellectual agenda. Not interested. Right? People are different. And he just wasn't engaged and inspired by what Stein was doing. And he said, you know, I don't want to please this guy. I'm just going to get my money and we're done. Jiang Xiaowang was the secretary for Stein's second expedition, and he had the opposite reaction. They both had the exact same job. They were Stein's Chinese secretaries. Jiang Xiaowang, for whatever reason, just because people are different, I guess, he loved Stein. He fully embraced Stein's higher intellectual agenda, eagerly helped out every time Chinese things were discovered, especially at Dunhuang in 1907, looked at them, cataloged them, had nightly discussions with Stein about what does this mean? What dynasty does this come from? All this sort of stuff. He was really into it. And the expedition was like the greatest thing that ever happened to him in his life. And we have these letters that survive back and forth in which he tells him, thank you so much. I love this opportunity. And he did get some additional compensations afterwards. Jiang Xiaowang was hired by the British consulate to work with George Macartney in the Kashgar British consulate for the rest of his life. That was steady employment. When he died, Stein paid for his coffin to be transported back to his homeland, his home province in Hunan, in the Chinese heartland. That was very important to Jiang Xiaowang. He had a patron, Stein. Stein liked this guy a lot, so he was willing to pay money out of his own pocket 10 years later to pay for Jiang Xiaowang's coffin when he died to be sent back. That's very important to Jiang. Jiang had a son who came out and met up with him. After many decades being distant, he came to Kashgar to meet his dad. After his dad died, the son had no job. Stein was able to arrange for his son to get a job in the Kashgar consulate as well. Right, so there were still some compensations that the technically educated assistants could access if they bought in to the intellectual agenda of the foreign archaeologist. It's not going to be additional wages usually, but it might be a very desirable job after the expedition is over, a good word, a letter of recommendation. There were still things you could get. Did Li Yansun get any of these things? Absolutely not, because Stein couldn't stand him. But if, you can see the different reactions that people may have had. Sometimes true friendship did occur. We know with Lal Singh, we have some evidence by 1930. I found some entries in Stein's diary in which right before he sets off on his fourth expedition, he says, Lal Singh has been dear old Lal Singh has been visiting me daily. Now, it's not much. It's a cryptic statement, but he refers to him as dear old Lal Singh, and we know that he's visiting him daily. That sounds like a friendship to me. I don't know about you, but that sounds like friends. That sounds like someone who, again, maybe he didn't buy into the whole intellectual agenda like the secretary Jiang Xiaowan did over here, but he certainly got along well with Stein, did the work well, didn't think that this was some massive hardship that he was bitter about having to do, and maintained a friendship with Stein well into his old age. I think Stein did actually write some letters of recommendations in the British Indian bureaucracy to help out with Lal Singh's career after the expedition was over, because he was pleased with his service during the expedition. All right. There are examples of disengagement and hardship with the local Muslims who engaged the expedition. All right. These are the depredations of cooperation, fear of injury and death. And hardship. As I said before, it's dangerous going out. It's even dangerous still with the foreign explorer. It's not guaranteed. And nothing's going to happen. And even if you survive, it's still miserable. You're still going into the desert for weeks at a time in freezing, frigid weather with winds, doing hard manual labor. It's not fun work if you're one of the manual laborers. And here I want to show you a video. I hope I have this at the right time. One moment here, 2440. Let me get this out. This is, before we get here. Oops. No, stop. All right, here we go. What are we seeing here? What we're seeing here is this is 1979. This is a Japanese film crew that's gotten permission to do a whole documentary series called The Silk Road throughout northwestern China. They retrace many of the sites and places that Stein and Paleo and these guys were into. At that time, it would have been like 80 years earlier, 70 years earlier. And they're visiting these sites. And here we see at one of these sites, they hear that there's a local man who claims that, 70 years ago, he led Stein into the desert. He was one of Stein's hired Uyghur guides. So they say, we're going to go meet with this guy. And I love the reaction of him. There's no sort of romantic, rosy nostalgia about what happened here. This is how he responds. I had this in the book as well.
We unexpectedly met a very old man who told us he had guided Stein to the Niai ruins in 1906, more than 70 years ago. Hello, I'm now 92 years old. I remember we found an old pot with a lot of red papers inside it. There must have been written documents. I know it was very cold at the time we found them.
Cold.
I didn't like it too much.
I love that. I didn't like it too much. The perfect understatement. It doesn't have the hyperbole and exaggeration that would make you think that this guy is just trying to get attention. It's very matter of fact. All right? This is what it was. It was very cold. I didn't like it too much. Red papers. He's not talking about some lofty historical agenda or anything like that. You have 4 languages here as well. I think this is a pirated version in Korean. So you have the Korean subtitles and there's 3 languages being spoken. Chinese, you have Japanese because the film crew is Japanese, and then he's speaking in Uyghur. So that's all the translation going back and forth. So that's one of the depredations of compensation. This guy just got his wages and he was really, really cold and didn't like it too much and didn't identify with the stuff that they were finding. We also see in this chapter recurrent fears of wild Tibetans. Wild Tibetans are always invoked all over the place. Oh, I can't even get out of here anymore. Sorry. I guess we have to leave it here until we're done. I'm almost done. Wild Tibetans, dragons, don't take me into the high mountain passes, 12,000 feet. You're going to get frostbite. It's very dangerous up there. I don't know that you're able to sort of bring us through safely. Sometimes the women would appeal, don't go. We have a couple examples here. Perhaps the only time women actually really appear in this book is the guy giving the 3 terracotta heads to his lover, and the wife and the mother who basically are in tears and say, "No, don't leave me." Why are they in tears? Do they think it's going to be dangerous? Do they need his help at home? Are they just going to miss him? We don't know. But the women folk are also asking them, don't go. And they don't. When we have these 2 examples in which the women make an entreaty, ask them not to go, they end up staying behind and not working for Stein. A holiday can be sufficient incentive not to engage the foreign explorer. Ramadan, we see over and over again, Paleo especially, is like, oh, it's Ramadan again, so I can't get anyone to go out and work with me. He's offering good money for wages, but Ramadan's more important. Or Bazaar Day. I say, it's bazaar day, so I only got 2 guys who are willing to leave the bazaar. Not everyone is going to be eager to go out and do this, and it's their choice. Remember, by and large, it's voluntary. Corvée labor is rarely invoked. Usually it's here, this is what I'm offering. If you're going to offer good wages, then we'll come work for you. But even if you're offering good wages, hey, today's the bazaar. I'm going to the market and I'm going to have fun. Maybe, tomorrow, if you're still willing, I'll go out and work for you. What are the options for disaffected laborers if you're not happy? Well, you do have some options. You can desert the caravan, but if you signed a contract, you're liable to its terms, and the foreign archaeologist can throw you in local jail because you did sign a contract for work. And if you go out and he's paying you, and suddenly you become a liability halfway along into the Taklamakan Desert, you say, I'm done with this, screw this. The foreigner has to take care of you. And he is going to turn you over to the Chinese authorities when you get back to town, and they will throw you in jail. As they would if you signed any sort of a contract and then you reneged on the contract. So you can try to desert, but that's dangerous. And if you're too unruly, if you make too much of a scene, remember, the Sahib is allowed to punish you. What are the forms of punishment that are allowed in the early 20th century? He can whip you. He can slap you. We have some examples of this. Paleo slapping his Chinese cook because he was too drunk. Stein having his camel factotum, Ibrahim Beg, whipped because he got into a brawl with other members of the caravan. All right. We'll end here. We've already gone far enough. We have a pretty good idea of the range of the compensations of cooperation, some of the depredations of cooperation as well. But my ultimate conclusion here, as you see in the chapter, is that we have to acknowledge the depredations of cooperation, but we also have to realize that the expeditions couldn't succeed if the compensations didn't outweigh the depredations. None of these, in the eyes of the local lower class, often illiterate people, ever rise to the point of a dispute, to the point that we would think about it today, where they say, you're a thief, this is criminal, you're taking things that belong to the Uyghur or Chinese nation. That concept doesn't exist. There are tensions, there are fights, there is acrimony, but it's pretty much usually related to what we would now regard as workplace disputes. So that's the important thing to remember here. Don't project our values back in time and imagine that when we see resistance to the foreign archaeologists, they're resisting on our terms today. Oh, cultural sovereignty, of course, they're protecting the heritage of their nation. No, they're not. They're annoyed that it's very cold out there. I didn't like it too much. There are wild dragons, there are wild Tibetans. My tent mate snores, my wife doesn't want me to leave, that sort of stuff. Those are the nature of the disaffection and tensions that we find on the expedition trail. All right, next time we're going to move our lens from the economic lower classes to the economic upper classes. We need 2 chapters to deal with this, accumulating culture and gentlemen of empire, to understand how the elite educated Confucian Chinese gentlemen, how they interacted with Antiquities, because they absolutely did. They interacted with them far, far longer than the Westerners did. What they regarded their value as, and then why they too were ultimately willing to lend their enthusiastic assistance to the Western archaeologist, even when they knew that he was going to remove these things from their country for all time. All right, see you then. Take care.